All right, good afternoon, class. Before I sign off for the weekend, I want to just follow through on what I said I would for today and talk a little bit about the experience of different social groups in North Africa and Southwest Asia. We had a lively discussion about what the U.S. led, or I should say the coalition led, war in Iraq, some of the various features of the human geography that chapter in this world region's history reveals. And also, Al Jazeera serves as sort of an interesting microcosm of the role of information and how, Al Jazeera in many respects represents a new era in this world region in terms of being able to tell its own story about events that are happening within its proximity, or within proximity to this region. So let's begin by looking at the experience of different groups. I'm going to try to be quick, and of course you can pause at any point if you need to jot down any notes or make note of any things that I say here, but let's get after it. Okay, so first off, we're looking at a world region that has really unique, there's definitely some intriguing distinctions that come into play when we talk about Southwestern Asia and North Africa. And of course, the Islamic faith has a fair amount to do with it, but also things like an economy that's largely related to natural resources, of course, oil being the biggest one, but not followed too far by natural gas, which is increasingly playing a strong role in this region. But specifically population growth, this is a world region that does not have really favorable physical geography, like when we talk about things like arable land and secure water resources, but nonetheless it possesses about 7% of the world's population. So this is a part of the world that is quite populous, especially considering its relatively I'd say inauspicious menu of physical geography. It doesn't have a whole lot of natural endowments there. But nonetheless, a large population. And part of this has to do with some of the specific aspects of its human geography, and particularly the role that women play within this region. We talked a little bit, or your textbook anyway, talks a little bit about how women have experienced, in many ways, a low social status within this world region. It might be tempting to say that that's the consequences of the Islamic faith, but I would suggest that it has more to do with the way that Arab culture has been interpreted, in part through the prism of Islam. But really and truly, Muhammad, if we take him and his experience as an example, he was actually far more open-minded and I guess equal in his treatment of women than the Islamic world has been in many of the centuries since. So sort of similar to how Christianity has its foundational values and the example of its leading figure of Jesus, but yet it has expressed itself at times through large chapters of its history, not necessarily consistent with some of those values and teachings that Jesus had. Some of the same can be said for Islam, in particular its treatment of women. Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, was actually very much his equal and a source of strength and a source of leadership and guidance in his life. So I'll leave it at that, but women's status has, in the many centuries since, in the Islamic world, been a secondary status. And, we know enough about world regional geography at this point to say that one of the incredible, correlations of development of a world region, it might be one of the best correlations, is if a region has women who are empowered and well educated, that region tends to be more developed. And so the reverse tends to be true in this world region, and as such, we have relatively limited development in Southwestern Asia, and North Africa. Contraception is not very widely practiced. Maybe 1/3 of the women in this world region have access to contraception. The fertility rate in this world region, it varies, but overall it's over 3 children per woman. And this is a pretty high rate, definitely high compared to the world average. And it's particularly high when you stop to think that this world region suffers from a lot of shortages of things like water and food and agricultural produce and so on and so forth. So we have some really noteworthy issues here. Also, because again, the way that contemporary Islam has become manifest in this region, there are a number of social practices that tend to support patriarchy and also support implicit bias and preference for young boys and men. In fact, it's a troubling cultural phrase, and I just learned this a couple of years ago, but in the Arab world, there's a figure of speech that if you walk into a room or if there's this uncomfortable silence, they have a phrase that essentially translates into, "What's wrong? Was a girl just born?" Meaning essentially, why is everyone so quiet and solemn? Was there a girl just born? As if that is something to be mourned as opposed to celebrated. So these cultural traits are somewhat deep-rooted throughout this region. You see here the population densities, and you can see, of course, as you get closer to the coasts, particularly along the Mediterranean, you tend to see greater concentration. And then there are definitely parts of Saudi Arabia. Some of these increased densities have to do with the Islamic sacred sites, such as those at Mecca and Medina. So it gives you a little snapshot of things going on here. And here I'll let you pause and study this if you choose to. This talks a little bit about the role of women in the economy, and I think this speaks to a couple things. One, the overall economic development throughout this world region, but also the some of the social challenges that confront this region and its unique relationship to women's opportunity. Okay, again, population, we'll skip through that. Okay, population patterns, what strategies are employed to meet the needs of labor? So you've already encountered this a little bit in your textbook, and I know Jefferson was kind enough to forward a link to the way that some migrant laborers, some of the challenges that they are facing in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. But one of the challenges that this region faces is that in some places there's tremendous wealth. In fact, there's so much wealth in places like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, that there is not a willingness among many of the everyday people in these countries to do the menial work. So they have that labor brought in, and sometimes their immigrant laborers live almost refugee-like existences. And some of the push factors in this region that have supported urbanization are improvements in agriculture, which have allowed for more efficient productivity. Even though agriculture is not an easy practice, there have been some technological breakthroughs that have allowed for agricultural enterprises to support a larger segment of the population in this region. But more importantly, pull factors, the cities, of course, jobs, and particularly in these well-to-do countries, we see a real magnetism for these large cities. Guest workers in many of the countries along the Persian Gulf can make up as much as 88%. I mean, it's an overwhelming percentage of the population, and it very much creates a sort of dual culture within these countries. And refugees are a particular challenge, we know, in places like the occupied Palestinian territories, places like Iraq in response to the last decade of warfare. Also, lots of refugees created by the conflicts between Iraq and Iran throughout much of the 80s. Refugees are not an unheard of, I mean, they're a very commonplace challenge. Of course, recent refugees in Libya, Egypt, now Syria, you name it, refugees are quite common. And your textbook talks a little bit about all the challenges and sort of collateral damages. There are many people in this region that are just angry. They're angry at their prospects. They're angry at their lot in life, and this makes it somewhat easy for regional players who would like to, radicalize these people. They become more vulnerable to that because they are not satisfied with the status quo in their lives. Okay, pardon me. So if we look here, this is the GDP per capita. So this map tells you a little bit of this world region relative to the world. But as your textbook points out, it's actually difficult to tell. So GDP, purchasing power per capita, that's a helpful measure in some respects, a helpful measure of development, but of course it doesn't really tell you, it's an average measure, so it doesn't tell you specifically that the resources and income within this world region are being shared evenly. And in fact, even in the really wealthy countries along the Persian Gulf, we know that wealth is sometimes something that is held by a relative few within that country. So even though there is tremendous wealth, there's also tremendous poverty, and we have an awfully difficult time getting accurate measures to tell us. One suggestion would be that when you see a map like this, which tells us about GDP, which doesn't look all that bad, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Oman and places like that, well, when the HDI measures, the Human Development Index, suggests that there isn't such high attainment, that tells you that probably this overall wealth is being hoarded or kept to a pretty concentrated segment of that society. Here's our HDI rank. I'll let you stop and look at that if you like. Okay, economic and political issues. Okay, OPEC, most of you are probably familiar. It's oil cartel. This was one of the great innovations of the 1960s. I say it was great. It was great for the oil interests within this world region because they finally figured out a system whereby they could control and increase the profits and the revenues that they were getting from the global oil trade. Up until the 1960s, countries like the United States and Europe were able to buy oil at a very affordable price. You go back and you look in the 50s and you could see a gallon of gas selling for a quarter or less. Of course, that's not the case now, partly due to inflation, but even more so due to the fact that these countries that control oil are controlling the prices and able to create quite a bit more profit for themselves. And the type of development that oil countries in the region have chosen. So it's pretty interesting if you look at and I'll close with this slide. One of the interesting messages that comes from this part of the world is that a reliance on oil, even though it's an incredibly lucrative natural resource, does come with certain consequences. Like in Middle and South America, when you base your economy largely on a commodity that's a natural resource, you aren't usually developing other parts of your economic development strategy. You're not a diverse economy, and this has real problems. There are a couple exceptions in this world region, and oddly enough, they come from two countries that don't actually have much access to oil, and those two countries would be Turkey and Israel. They're two of the most diverse economies, and they've probably become diverse in part because they do not have this easy